We've been going through the book of 1 Corinthians. We've made our way as far as chapter 7, verse 17. So if you have a Bible, would you open up that Bible along with us? 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the 17th verse. Now, if you don't have a Bible, there's one underneath the seat in front of you. We would be glad for you to pick one up. And then if you don't own one, please make it your own. I think one of the things that changes a person's life is beginning to understand what God declares and what God says. And then as you begin to study that book, it will have an impact upon your life. And so we would love for you to have one of those if you need one. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. If you remember, in the context of what's happening, Paul is writing a letter to a church that he had founded. For 18 months, he had poured into this church. He discipled them. He raised up leaders in that church. And then he departed and continued his missionary journey. He gets word that there were some problems in that church. Things that kind of went a little bit off course. And so he's writing an epistle to kind of address some of those things. Many of them were questions that they were asking. Now think about it. In that culture, in that time, Christianity was just being spread. Jesus, not many years prior, had given his life as a payment for sin, and that gospel was spreading throughout the known world. And as Paul had come and presented the gospel, many had responded, given their life to Christ, but they had no background spiritually. They were pagans. They would worship at the temple of Aphrodite. There at the temple of Aphrodite, she was the goddess of fertility and sex. And so they would literally partake as part of their worship in the activity of 1,000 temple prostitutes. And that was how they grew up. And so they had a lot of questions. What's this whole Christian life supposed to look like? What does it mean I'm a new creation? What does this mean that my life's to be changed and transformed? And so many of those questions are being asked of Paul. And if you'll go back with me to verse 1 of chapter 7, it's where he begins to answer the questions. The first 6 chapters, he's addressing some problems. Now he's answering questions. In verse 1 of chapter 7, he says, "Now concerning the things which you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman." Now, notice that first part, concerning things of which you wrote to me. That's really what's happening here. He's fielding questions. They were asking, one of those questions is, now that I'm a Christian, should I abstain from sexual activity altogether, even though I'm married? And so Paul addresses that. He addresses that the marriage relationship was where that drive was to be satisfied. Nowhere else, but God created that drive, and God's the one who put that desire within our hearts and within our lives to fulfill that need, but it's only to be done so within the husband and the wife relationship. And so he addresses that. I think one of the questions was, man, it's so sexually toxic in our culture here in Corinth. Should that be something we just forego altogether? And he says, no way. That's not to happen. Matter of fact, the marriage relationship was where that is to be taken care of. He says in one of the other questions I was asked to him, now that I'm a Christian and my husband's not a Christian, or I'm a Christian and my wife's not a Christian, does that mean that I can divorce him? And Paul would go on to answer that question saying, hey, you're to stay in that marriage. You're to be more committed to that marriage now that you're a Christian than before you were a Christian. Because now you understand what marriage is all about. And he gives them a very clear, a husband's not to depart from his wife, and a wife not from her husband, that you guys are to remain in the marriage as long as the unbelieving husband's willing to live with you, or the unbelieving wife's willing to live with you, then you're to be committed to that relationship. And so all of these are questions that he's fielding. One of the other questions was, marriage. Should I get married? The single people, were asking Paul, is it a good idea for me to marry or not to marry? And he goes on in that passage, he says, if at all possible, stay single. That was his advice. It's here. Because you might look at that and go, man, Paul kind of disses marriage. That's not what he's doing. We're going to see why he's saying these things in this chapter, the finishing of this chapter. And that's what we're going to cover this morning. Now, the next question, beginning in verse 17, that he jumps right into, he says, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Verse 19. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become a slave of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. Now, he's really answering the question for many of those new believers. You know, those new believers going, man, I'm a Christian now. You know, do I change my job? You know, do I separate myself from all of my family and friends that aren't Christians? Do I just kind of change my whole life in that perspective? And so Paul, just one by one, he says, look, God is distributed to each one. And then he says, as the Lord has called each one, let him walk. In other words, he's saying, look, wherever you are in life, just because you become a Christian doesn't mean that you're to change everything. You know, I need to move. I need to have a different career. I need to have a different job. I gotta have make a difference in a different way. And that might be the case if God were to call you to that. But he's saying you don't necessarily think that just now I'm a Christian. Now I got to become a missionary, or I got to become a pastor. I got to become something that's going to have more of an impact. No, he says, look, God's called you where you are. You need to bloom where you're planted. You need to be effective right where God has you. Because God's called you there. He knew your life. He knew when you were going to get saved. He knew where you were going to get saved. And so he's saying, look, rather than trying to find some other thing to do or some other priority to live your life for, you need to just be where God has you and you begin to grow there. I think that's an important point that he's making. It's one of the questions that I think oftentimes, a new Christian is going to ask. I'm only a postman now. I got to do something more effective. No, God put you there. Why don't you be a light to all the other postmen? Well, why don't you make a difference in the place that God's placed you? It might be down the road God's going to have something different for you, but that's your job right now is to be an effective witness for Him right where He has you. I think that's the same thing. I think sometimes we get saved and we want. I got to just hang around with church people now. I can't hang around with any non-Christians or any family members, and that's not necessarily true. You're going to have a greater influence in their life because they're the one who are going to see the change more than anybody else. They're the ones who are going to notice, man, what happened to you? You used to be a creep. And now you're not as creepy. They're the ones that are going to notice the transformation. Now, if you're going to someone you never knew, they're not going to even acknowledge that a change has taken place. And so you're going to have a greater impact in that circle of friends that you have. Now, I know for me, I had to kind of cut myself off from a lot of my friends because all my friends were doing what I was doing. Drinking and partying and smoking dope. And, I had to kind of, for a time, till I got strong enough to not be influenced by that any longer, I had to kind of isolate myself until I was able to go back and start to share with them and, explain what God had done in my life. And then that might be the case for you. You're like, I do need to change friends. I can't be around the same influence I used to be, because I might fall, I might stumble, I might be tripped up along the way. And if that's the case, then go for it. But wherever you're called, thrive there. And allow God the opportunity to mature you and grow you. You don't necessarily have to change careers. Now, there's some exceptions to that. Like if you're a drug dealer, it's a good idea to change careers. Right? I'm a Christian now. I think I need to stop dealing drugs. You're into prostitution? Probably a good idea to change careers. But for the most part, you see, this Christian life, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're going to be the next Billy Graham. It means you need to be where God has you. And I love how he just simply tells them, look, and he uses it in a great illustration. Look at the illustration in verse 18. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Guys, you know that's an analogy, right? That's not a possibility. Once you're circumcised, you're circumcised. You can't go, well, I'm going to be uncircumcised now. That's not going to happen. So what he's trying to say is, look, you don't have to change who you are outwardly in order to continue in your walk with the Lord. Many of them were Jews coming to faith. He said, you don't have to become un-Jewish because you got saved. Matter of fact, you need to be an effective light to the community that you have access to. And so he says, don't become uncircumcised. Or if you were uncircumcised, don't become circumcised. You don't have to, now I got to follow the Old Testament law and commandments, and I got to go through all. No, he says, you don't need to do that. Wherever you're at, you be effective in your faith, in your testimony. And so he's encouraging them to not to go make this unnecessary change. And I think, as a new Christian, and I love to be around new Christians. It's exciting to see, they realize what God's delivered them from, and they can have a great zeal and just say, you know what, I remember when I got saved, I was ready to quit my job. I need to go into full-time ministry. And I remember going to the church and talking to one of the pastors, I just want to serve the Lord. And he says, what happened? I just quit my job. He says, let me tell you the first thing you need to do, go get a job. Okay. Because you need to grow in the Lord. You need to see what God has for your life. But be a light where he has you right now. And so that was his encouragement to them. I love at the end of verse 19, he says, look, keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Isn't that good? He says, you just obey God where you're at. That's what counts. You keep his commandments. I love that over and over the scripture encourages us in that same idea. In John chapter 5, I think it's 1 John 5:2, it says this, by this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and we keep his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. I love that. Look, I'm not doing something that's against my will. I'm obeying the commandments of God because I love God. And because I love God, I want to follow God. It's not some heavy load I'm trying to carry. It's something that, God's changed in me. I want to follow his word. I want to obey the things that he's declared so that I'm getting to know him in a greater way. And the way you get to know him is you get closer to him. The way you get closer to him is to obey him and discover who he is through his word. And so it's here that he's encouraging the church in Corinth. You just obey God right where you're at, right where he has you. Whatever job you might find yourself in, what position in life you might find yourself in. Notice what he says there in verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Remain in the same calling in which you were called. I mean, in other words, wherever you were, whatever you were doing, just keep doing it. As long as you're not disobeying God, you're right where you're supposed to be. And then look at there in verse 21 where he says, were you called as a slave? Do not be concerned about it. Now, it's been reported that in Corinth, over half the population were slaves. And you can purchase your freedom if you saved up enough, you did side jobs, and you kind of accumulated enough money to go to the person who owned you, and you go, hey, I want to buy my freedom, and you would pay them so that you're not in bondage to them as a slave any longer. And he says, if that's possible, praise the Lord, go for it. Better yourself. Make yourself, more useful for the kingdom. That's a good thing. But don't, stress over it. You just be faithful where God's placed you and let God use you right where you're at. And so he says, don't make that an issue. Then he reminds them there in verse 23, and I think this is a very important, and I think here's the perspective and all that he's declared to them. He says, you were bought at a price. Do not become a slave of men. You were bought at a price. Now, when you gave your life to Jesus Christ, when that moment you said, God, I'm a sinner, I'm in bondage to sin, I'm a slave of sin, and you paid the price for me, what you've declared is that I don't own my life anymore. My life was purchased by Jesus Christ. He owns me now. I'm a slave of God. Now, you're a slave of somebody. Every one of us. A slave of sin, a slave, to this world. You're a slave of, to yourself, to your desires, to your flesh. You can be owned by a lot of different things. But once you come to Christ, man, your life doesn't belong to you any longer. And that's what he's reminding them. Look, you were bought at a price. He had told them that earlier in chapter 6, verse 19. Remember that passage? Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own, for you were bought at a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. God purchased you. He owns you. And he knew where you would get saved. He knew, where you would be when you got saved. And he says, you just be faithful where God has you. That you don't get distracted by the things of this world or, by the priorities that you used to have. But that now you're living your life for the glory of God. And that's done right where you're at. Now, notice verse 24. He says, brethren, and again, he's summarizing everything. Brethren, let each one remain with God in the state in which he was called. So he ends that section reminding them that, their life was to be lived right where they were. And then verse 25, watch this. Now, concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loose from a wife? Do not seek a wife. If you do marry, you have not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. Another question comes up. Should I get married? Should marriage be a priority? If I'm already married, should I seek to get loose? And he goes, wait. Remember, that same principle in your marriage. In whatever state you're in. You're married when you got saved, then remain married. You're single when you got saved, then, don't go seeking after a wife. You just seek to walk in a right relationship with God. Now, it is an interesting passage, is that he's really telling us to be content in where God's placed you. And I think it's always, doesn't the grass always look greener on the other side? Like, man, if I was only single, life would be so much better. And then the single people are saying, if I was only married, life would be so much better. I heard someone say, if the grass is greener on the other side, it's probably so is the water bill. Higher. Right? You realize that it's not always what it seems to be. You need to be content where you're at. And if you're content where you're at, then God is going to, go before you and guide you to where he wants you to be. And so Paul's giving them some practical advice. Question is, should I get married? Should I get divorced? Should I? And he's going, no, you remain where you're at. And then he gives some advice. Look, if you're not married yet, don't get married. Anybody okay with that? If you're not married yet, stay single. Now, you kind of read that. Wait a second. I thought we were supposed to marry and multiply. And, I thought that was, the whole heart. No, he's saying, look, don't make that the priority of your life. Now, if God brings you a wife, praise the Lord. And let me tell you, a wife can be a blessing. A husband could be a blessing. Or they could be the opposite. Depends on whether you both have the same priorities, the same perspective. I thank God. I remember when I was beginning to date Marguerite. I remember that one of the first times we went out, it was the first questions that I asked her, or kind of the statement that I made to her was, babe, Marguerite, she wasn't babe yet. Marguerite, God's called me to Belen. He's called me to be a pastor. And I'm going to be moving there. Now, if you have no desire to move to Belen, we probably shouldn't date. We probably shouldn't take this any further, because this is what God has put in my heart. And if you're not even open to that, it's, we're wasting our time. And I can't tell you how God worked all that out. It would take a long time. But I remember her just saying, man, I know that God is, given me a desire to serve him too. And she's been my helpmate for these last 29 years. She's been the one who's been my encourager, and the one when I'm ready to throw in the towel, encourage me to stay the course. And I tell you, I thank God every day that he brought my wife alongside to be my helper, to be my helpmate. And she's been a blessing. Now, that should be the person a single person is looking for. I want someone that's going to be running the same direction that I'm running, so that we're assisting each other in what God's called us to do. And if that's the case, you're going to have a blessed marriage. You're going to have an awesome marriage. Now, you have someone that doesn't want to, you want to serve the Lord, and they have no desire to, you're going to be just constantly battling each other. And so Paul's encouragement, look, if you're going to remain single, then remain single. And he's going to tell us why here in a second, but he's really encouraging them, make sure that you have your priorities right. It's not just getting married for the idea of getting married. It's getting married because I want to make sure that I'm doing God's work and God's will in my life. Now, this is why I say that. Look what he says in verse 29. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they do not weep. Those who rejoice as those who do not rejoice. Those who buy as though they do not possess. And those who use this world are not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. Notice where he kind of gives us an insight into the reasons he's saying many of the things he's saying. He really had a priority about eternity. The time is short. And when Paul was writing this epistle to the Corinthians, within 10 years, the church would go under heavy persecution by Rome. Nero would blame the Christians for burning down Rome, and it would be open season on Christians, and many of them would die as a result of it. Within 15 years from the writing of this, Jerusalem would be surrounded by the Roman officer Titus, and they would destroy Jerusalem and the walls and the temple, and it would all come tumbling down. And so what Paul is encouraging them, look, we're living in very, very, volatile times right now. And if you're going to go and get married, you're going to have another responsibility to care for your wife, or to be concerned about your husband, than if you were single. You have a lot more freedom to be used in a different way than someone who's married. And so Paul's encouragement to them is, look, the time's short. Now, if Paul believed that time was short in his day, and I believe he was convinced that Jesus would come back in his day, and I'm convinced Jesus is coming back in my day, right? And I think that was intentional. I think every generation should have that expectation that Jesus is coming back in their lifetime. I think you and I have more reason than any generation to believe that, as we're watching our world heading in the direction that it's heading. We're seeing, morality just being destroyed in the culture you and I are living in. And we're watching all of this happen. We see what's going on with Iran right now. They're threatening, to get the nuclear bomb. They've already said that they want to destroy the United States. They want to destroy Israel. And it could be leading to a war. And Russia now is kind of in the middle of that. And China, in the middle of that. And you just kind of like, who knows what tomorrow's going to hold? None of us do. You look at just the last 2 days, what's happened in California. I mean, earthquake, 7.1. I mean, that could have been catastrophic. And that would have had an impact upon our whole nation. And then you realize that one election from now, things could turn drastically, as this whole idea of socialism is being promoted in our electorate right now. And socialism hasn't worked for any other nation, guys, and all of a sudden we think that somehow we can make it work. We were in Pucallpa a couple weeks ago, and there were Venezuelans that were employed there. And Marguerite got a chance to converse with one of he was working in the ice cream shop, and he was saying, man, the conditions here in Pucallpa are 10 times better than what I came from in Venezuela. And we're in Pucallpa. It was rough. And they were going, this is way better than what we came from. There's food. There's employment. We have the ability to, you just look at where that path leads. And yet that's something that's on the table right now. And so you can look at one election away and things can go south very quick. One terrorist attack could turn everything upside down. And what the idea here is that we need to be living our lives with eternity as our priority, not this world. This world one day is going to be destroyed. And if we're going to live our lives with this world as our priority, then you're going to be disappointed someday. You're going to be let down. And that's why he says there in verse 29, he says, the time's short. From now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. I know some of your guys are going, I like that verse. And your wife's saying, you already live like that. What do you mean? You see, he's not saying that we're to neglect responsibility. Here's what he is saying. He's saying, don't let your current situation deter you from doing what God's called you to do. Even if you're already married, you're still to fulfill what God's asked of you. You're still to live your life for the kingdom of heaven. You're still to have the same priorities that, we're to be seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. That doesn't change because you're married. He says, look, you live your life, just as radically while you're married as if though you weren't married. And if you have a believing spouse, then that's that much better that you can be living your lives together in that fashion. Notice what he says in the next verse 30. He says, those who weep as those who do not weep. And I think he's really talking about those that are mourning. Someone's died. It can be debilitating. If a spouse dies, or a daughter dies, or a son dies, or a family member dies that you're really close to, and you just become, totally incapacitated, that you really, aren't functioning in this world any longer. He goes, look, those that are weeping as though you're not weeping. In other words, live your life for the kingdom of heaven. Be effective where God's placed you. Allow God to, use your circumstance and your situation for His glory. So those of you that are weeping, weep no longer. Use your life for God's glory. Do the things that God's put in front of you. He's put you where you're at. And you're to take advantage of that opportunity. Notice what he says, and those who rejoice as though they do not rejoice. He goes from one end of the spectrum to the other. That person that's weeping, and this guy's just, as happy as can be, and he has no care in the world. He's living his life, just for the pleasures or for the temporary. And he's saying, look, don't live like that any longer. Matter of fact, you should be living your life with a heavenly perspective, with a different priority. That you're living your life for the things that count, the things that are eternal. And we can get so caught up in the things of this world and all the pleasures that it brings that we begin to camp out here rather than acknowledge that this is temporary. This isn't our home. We're just pilgrims passing through. And so he says, look, those who are rejoicing as though you're not rejoicing. Look what he says. Those who buy as though they do not possess. Another obstacle, another thing that can cause us to be distracted from our calling and from our purpose that God has for us. We just start accumulating things. I'm buying more, bigger house, bigger car, nicer things. And we get so caught up in the possessions that we lose sight of eternity. And I think, that can be an obstacle for us. I got to keep up with the Joneses. I want a bigger house. I want a bigger car. I want all of the things that this world offers me. And he's encouraging them. Look, live your life in light of the things that are to come. Live your life for eternity. That's when your life's going to count. And you can have an endless list of things you want to do here. But if you're investing everything here, and you're investing nothing there, you missed it. You missed the purpose that God called you, the purpose that God saved you, the things you wanted to do in your life. You wasted it on the temporal when you could have been investing it in the eternal. And so he reminds them, look, I love the next passage. Watch what he says, verse 31. Those who use this world as not misusing it. Why? For the form of this world is passing away. There's the whole perspective. This is all temporary, guys. You're only going to be here for a little while, like it or not. You're a teenager, you're in your 20s, you think, I got all the time in the world. I understand 30 years ago I thought the same thing. Now I'm realizing I don't got that much time left. And it goes like nothing. So quick, so rapid. And you kind of look back 30 years ago, man, when I was in my 20s, I thought I didn't ever think I would hit where I'm at now. And 10 years, 20 years from now, I'm going to be in my final push. And you realize that the time's short. The time is short. And it's having that perspective. Now, I love what John in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, I think he gave that same perspective. He says in 1 John 2:15, he says, do not love the world or the things in the world. For anyone who loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father. Check this out. But is of the world, and the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever. He says, look, all of this is passing away. This is all going to come to an end. But those who live their lives for the kingdom of heaven, those who are abiding in the love of God and abiding in the principles that God establishes, and look, you're going to live forever. It's eternity compared to temporal that you're weighing out here. And what Paul's encouraging them is, look, you need to be living your life for the things that are going to count. Guys, these are principles. These are principles that we can all apply to our life. And I think that those are good questions that we should be asking ourselves. Is this marriage? Is this boyfriend? Is this girlfriend? Are they going to enhance my walk with God? Or are they going to deter from that? And if you can't honestly say, you know what, they love the Lord as much, if not more than I do, man, then is that really a relationship that is going to benefit your spiritual life? Or maybe it's, the decisions. And I think, again, the principles, man. Do I really need to have a bigger house or a bigger car or a nicer car? Is that really going to bless, or is that going to deter me? That, now I got a bigger bill I got to pay every month and a bigger mortgage, and I got to, the upkeep of everything. Is that really going to be something beneficial, or am I going to have to work 60 hours a week or 80 hours a week in order to pay for all this stuff and deter me from doing what God's called me to do? I mean, those are all principles when we're making decisions that'll be valuable for us. Because we're considering everything in the light of eternity, not in light of the temporal. And I think it's all that Paul is doing is he's taking these biblical principles of priority and he's applying them to very specific situations in their lives. Now, I'm convinced of this. The Bible has an answer for every question you can ask. The Bible has an answer for every question you can ask. It's applying the very biblical principles to that question, and you can come to a very clear conclusion. Is this really going to be a blessing, or is this going to be a distraction? Is this going to be something that's going to benefit, or is this something that's going to hinder my walk with God? Or is this going to be something that's going to, benefit my walk with God? And those are questions you and I should be asking when we're making decisions, big decisions, little decisions. Are these things going to be a plus or a minus? Are they going to be a benefit or a distraction? And if we would ask those questions before we made the decision, we would have a better quality life when it comes to our spiritual life. And so he's encouraging them concerning these things. Now, verse 32, as we continue through the passage, watch what he says. I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There's a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may, check it out, here's the reason for all of it, that you may serve the Lord without distraction. Interesting. He's saying, look, if you're married, you're going to have more responsibilities caring for your wife. Then the kids come. And, your time, your resources, your energy, now it's in rate. Now, those are noble things. Paul's not trying to take away from those things. He's just saying, look, think about this in light of eternity. You need to make a quality decision. You need to ask yourself those very important questions. Because once you're married, now you have a responsibility to your spouse, to your husband or to your wife. To meet their needs, to make sure that they're cared for. To make sure that everything is paid for. I'm trying to think of another word there. Now, There was a cemetery in England. There was a grave marker with the inscription, "She died for want of things." Alongside that sign was another grave marker. And it read, "He died trying to give them to her." The whole picture was, they lived their whole life wanting to satisfy rather than living their life for the things that are eternal. And I think there's just a principle here. And I think Paul's trying to establish that principle with the Christian community. He wanted them to understand, look, if you're got your whole effort, your whole time, and you're caring for the needs of your spouse, then it could be a distraction from doing what God's called you to do. Now, again, he says, I'm not trying to put a leash on you. I like that he says that. I'm not trying to put some head trip on you. I'm just trying to share with you another perspective, an eternal one that maybe you should consider. And I think we should all consider that. If you're a single person here, maybe you should consider, maybe the Lord has a plan that I'm to go to the mission field. And if I'm married and, I'm not going to be able to do that. And so, you consider, what does God want for you? What has God called you to do? And that you're not making you're not sinning if you get married, or you're not sinning if you go a different direction, but he's just saying, hey, take that as in consideration, considering the times that we're living in. And then he now continues in verse 36, and he says, if any man thinks if he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, has so determined in his heart that he'll keep his virgin, he does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well. He who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. Now let me back that up. Now, again, I read many commentaries on this passage, and there wasn't a consensus in any of it. Here's what I came away with. Paul is talking to fathers who, in that culture, in that day, would be giving their daughters away as brides. And he's saying, look, if you can kind of, keep her and she can serve the Lord, and this whole idea that, she's going to spend her time or energy in the service of the Lord, he says, and that's possible, then that's awesome. That's a good thing. If she wants to marry and you allow that to happen, in that culture that had that permission from mom and dad in order to do that, from dad in order to do that, he says, and you can keep her as someone who's not married, then, bless you. If she wants to get married and you give into that, and that's where she goes, then you know what? Bless you too. There's not a wrong here. It's all about considering the eternal in our decision making. And I think this whole passage really has that heart to it. It's, guys, you and I are only here for a short time. You have a limited amount of days, and then we're going to be in heaven with the Lord for eternity. The scripture tells us that you're storing up treasures right now by your faithfulness of what God's entrusted to you. So you're going to store your treasures in heaven. Remember, Jesus says, don't store your treasures on earth where the moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store your treasures in heaven where neither moth or rust or thieves can take it away. And I think that's the perspective that Paul's wanting to give the Corinthian church. And I think for us today as well, that we would be living our lives in light of eternity. That everything we do, every decision we make would be, is this something that's going to be beneficial to my Christian life, to honoring God, to bringing glory to his name? And if we would filter everything with that in light, in that as the barometer that we take, your life and my life would be so much better. And so it's an encouragement, to make the eternal The priority. Now, he finishes in verse 39. Watch this. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. If her husband dies, she's at liberty to be married to whom she wishes. Watch this. Only in the Lord. I like that. What's he reminding again? Look, if a widow, her husband's passed, she desires to get married, she can get married. She's not sinning in doing so. But make sure that you're doing it in the Lord. In other words, make sure you find someone else who loves the Lord, who has the same desire to please the Lord that you have, and make sure that, that's the priority in remarrying. What a, just real practical encouragement. Now, we know that Paul encouraged, it says, when we get to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, he says, do not be unequally yoked together with an unbeliever. For what has light to do with darkness? What does Belial, have to, do with Christ? And what he's declaring is, look, if you're going to get married, you're becoming one with the person you're marrying. Now, if you're already married and you get saved and you're with an unbelieving, that marriage is sanctified. But if you go into this marriage and you pick someone that's not a believer and you're a believer, you're asking for anguish in your life. You're asking for problems. You're asking for real, conflict to take place, especially as you have kids and, your spouse doesn't want them to grow in the Lord or to go to church. And, you guys are battling over these things and your kids are in the middle of the conflict. He's saying, what, make sure that if you're going to get married, you're going to remarry, make sure it's in the Lord. Make sure that it's a God-centered relationship. Just basic principles that you should be living your life by. And I think it's a great encouragement for us that we would be reminded of those things. Paul says in the last verse 40 there, he says, but she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God. You got to love Paul's heart. You're going, look, you can remarry, but I'll tell you what, you're better off not doing it. Because then you can give your attention to the things that are eternal. And, I think as we go through this, next week, we kind of come back to a very convicting, he's talking about the conscience and the conscience of others. And guys, chapter 8 is a very heavy chapter, and we'll be covering that in the weeks to come. And just this whole idea of living your life for the kingdom of heaven. He just now broached, the beginning of this. He just kind of began to touch on this. But really living our lives for the eternal. And that really is the priority. And it should be, guys, especially because of the days we're living in. And Jesus can come back at any moment. Do you know that? There's nothing that has to happen before Jesus comes back again. Everything biblically, all the prophecies that were given, all of them have happened except for one, and that's the rapture of the church being removed out of this world, and then the 7 years of tribulation beginning. Everything else has happened. And so you and I are, the only event that we're waiting for is for Jesus to come back. And it could happen at any moment. It can happen at any minute. And I think that the exhortation is that we're living our lives with that as a priority, and that we're expecting his return. Jesus in Matthew 24, verse 42, he says, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed the house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready. Watch, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. That was Jesus talking. He says, anyone who, has a house and when the thief's going to come, you'd have been prepared for that thief to come. But now Jesus is coming and you don't know when it is, so you need to be ready always. And you and I need to be living our lives with that as the priority. Man, Jesus can come back at any moment. Am I ready? Am I living my life in such a fashion that when he comes back, I'm going to hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant? And if that's the case, then man, when he returns, it's going to be quite quite a joyous moment and quite a joyous time, because we've been faithfully doing what he's asked us to do, been living our lives with eternity as the priority.